What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we're going to be watching a video titled "Why US Inflation is So High and Going Higher." Let's see what this video is about.
When the war in Iran kicked off, there was some suggestion that the American economy would be relatively insulated from any associated rise in oil prices, thanks to the US's position as the world's biggest oil producer and the related fact that the US doesn't really import any oil from the Middle East anymore. That isn't how things have panned out. According to data published last week, headline inflation came in at 3.8% in April, the highest since May 2023 and the highest in the G7, while the Producer Price Index, which basically tells you how much inflation producers are experiencing and is generally considered a pretty good predictor of future headline inflation, came in at an eye-watering 6%, the highest since December.
I was about to say that, it's normal that it would change, but that's quite a lot, no?
For 2022. So in this video, we're going to explain why US inflation has risen further and faster than most people expected, and why things could get quite a lot worse yet. This map shows all of the places Trump has launched military offensives since returning to the White House last year. How did we reach this point? In the latest issue of our magazine, we run through a timeline of Trump's military chaos around the world. That's just some of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So we're basically going to split this video into two parts. First, we're going to explain why the US economy is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock, at least from an inflationary perspective. And then, second, we're going to explain why the US might be more at risk of a prolonged and potentially more severe inflationary episode, even if the energy crisis abates. Hint, this mostly has to do with Trump's growing influence over America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. Anyway, before we get on to that, let's start with the first bit. Broadly speaking, we think the US is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock for two reasons. The first and simplest reason is that inflation was already running relatively hot in the US, at least compared to most other similarly developed economies. For context, in February of this year, essentially the month before...
Isn't inflation kind of going on everywhere right now?
Before the war kicked off, year-on-year inflation was running at 2.4% in the US. This is both above the Federal Reserve's 2% target and pretty high by international standards. In Germany, for instance, inflation was running at 1.9%, while in France it was just 1%. In fact, the only G7 country with a higher inflation rate than the US going into the war was the UK. And, well, having a more functional economy than the UK is hardly a brag at the moment. Anyway, the second reason that the US is surprisingly exposed to the current energy shock is that the US is actually more dependent on fossil fuels than is often assumed. For context, some commentators have argued that America's position as the world's biggest oil producer means it's effectively insulated from the current energy shock, or at least more so than oil importing countries in Europe and Asia. But this is, well, wrong. While it's true that the rise of fracking and shale oil, which really took off in the 2010s, has indeed turned the US into the world's biggest oil producer, the US economy is just massive.
But it doesn't make sense. If the oil mostly in the US, I don't know how much they get from the Middle East, but if it mostly comes from the US alone, why would it affect?
And diversified. So what happens in the oil sector isn't really material to the wider economic outlook. This makes the US unlike other big oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia, which are far more dependent on oil for both their wider economies and their tax bases. So while this energy shock
Can you hear that? They're coming to get me.
Has indeed been great for American oil companies, it's been bad for everyone else. And somewhat unsurprisingly, the positive consequences of higher prices for American energy producers are dwarfed by the negative consequences for the rest of the economy, which is actually remarkably exposed to oil shocks. For context, the so-called oil intensity of the US economy, which basically tells you how much oil the economy consumes to produce $1 of GDP.
They just put the car photo when they were saying the positives, and I thought that they were going to say that there's less traffic or something like that, but...
is roughly twice that of the EU. This implies that, contrary to received wisdom, the US economy is actually more exposed to an oil price shock than other countries. This also explains why the US has already seen a far steeper rise in energy prices than other similar economies. For context, year-on-year inflation for energy specifically jumped from 0.5% in February to 12.5% in March, and then an eye-watering 17.9% in April. This is a far steeper increase than we've seen in the euro area, where energy inflation came in at 5.1% in March and then 10.9% in April. In fact, as of March, the latest month for which we have complete data, the US is currently experiencing the highest energy inflation in the G7. Again, this likely reflects the fact that the US economy is more geared around the consumption of fossil fuels than other similarly developed economies, which have thus proved more able to offset the increase in oil and gas prices by leaning on alternative energy sources. This is also the main reason that the US saw the joint highest inflation in the G7 along with the UK that month, with year-on-year CPI coming in at 3.3%, and will probably top the rankings in April, given US inflation came in at 3.8%, while the UK's inflation rate is actually expected to fall to 3%. So you get the idea. The US is surprisingly exposed to the ongoing energy shock, both because inflation was already running pretty hot, and because of the American economy's wider reliance on fossil fuels. On to the second part of this video, why the US could be in for a more prolonged inflationary shock. This is basically because of Trump's willingness to exert influence over America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. For context, in most developed countries, the central bank is primarily responsible for...
I don't think that US should be very negatively affected by all of this though, like in a broader sense, because Trump is kind of the one who is, well, not Trump, but I guess the government, but America is the one who's kind of moving the game, so they can, I think there is more probability that they won't be affected as badly because they can kind of control that, if that makes sense.
Taming inflation. Central banks achieve this by raising interest rates, which essentially makes it more expensive to borrow money. This slows the economy down, reducing growth, but also means there's less money circulating in the economy. And if you've got less money chasing the same amount of stuff, this should, in theory, mean lower prices and less inflation. Anyway, in most developed countries, central banks are independent, meaning they're supposed to be essentially insulated from political interference. The theory behind this separation between politics and central banking is that, in short, politicians apparently aren't very good at taming inflation because they don't like raising interest rates and slowing down the economy, especially before an election. Anyway, somewhat unsurprisingly, Trump isn't too committed to the idea of central bank independence and has proven very willing to put pressure on America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, in his campaign for lower interest rates. He has constantly attacked Fed Chair Jerome Powell, labelling him Too Late Powell and launching what looked like a politically motivated investigation into Powell's handling of the renovation of the central bank's Washington headquarters. Powell was able to weather Trump's assault, but is due to be replaced by Trump's nominee Kevin Warsh, who has apparently already promised Trump lower rates sometime in the next few days. The risk here is, with Powell sidelined, Trump is able to basically bully Warsh and the rest of the Fed into cutting interest rates, even if inflation is running hot, to avoid an economic slowdown before the midterms. This could push inflation up even further, with destabilizing impacts for the US economy. Now, you're probably looking to learn more about this story and keep up with how it progresses, and the first place you're going to start is online. But in today's world, it feels like 99% of websites demand your email.
Oh my goodness, the rest is just an ad. That was a short video. That was a very short video and a very short explanation of it, honestly. I mean, it just shows the rates and then that's kind of it. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense that a situation like this would affect globally, but I don't know. You guys tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me for this video. It was very, very brief, way briefer than what I thought it would be. And I guess please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!